No one has paid a higher price for the far left's destructive agenda than Americans living in our nation's inner cities. They have paid a dear price. For decades, these communities have been run exclusively by Democrat politicians, and it's been total one-party control of the inner cities. For 100 years, it's been one-party control, and look at them. We can name one after another, but I won't do that, because I don't want to be controversial. We want no controversy.
Now, of course, Ohio is a battleground state that President Trump won by 8 points in 2016, and it'll be essential for the president if he wants to reclaim the White House in 2020. Joining me now from our bureau in Washington, D.C., political correspondent and video journalist Nicholas Ballasy. So, Nicholas, in regard to right now, the president's already kind of on the campaign trail, if you will. I know that may not necessarily be a campaign rally, but it's very much so the intent of what he's doing. So if the election were today, how is the president faring?
I think it's too early to tell because, you know, we don't know who the Democratic candidate's going to be. I mean, it depends on who he would be running against if the election were held today. But, I mean, the economy, the state of the economy is working in his favor. But if you look at some recent polls, independent voters are not necessarily supportive of his style. The random tweets and the attacks on specific members of Congress could backfire. So we'll see what happens. But I think right now the economy is the best thing that's working in the president's favor.
And you bring up right now that we don't necessarily know who the Democrat candidate is, and that's absolutely true. But he is kind of picking on this, he calls them the squad right now. Do you think that is a little bit of his way of kind of setting up the match for him, and not necessarily against the Democrat presidential candidate, but kind of this squad, the one that he calls more progressive and anti-American? Do you think he's kind of setting up that fight where the American people are comparing him to them and not necessarily who will be on the ticket in 2020?
That's very possible. I think by sending out those tweets and criticizing the specific members of the so-called squad, I think the effort there on his part was to get the Democratic Party as a whole to defend them and kind of marry the two. So the Democratic Party as a whole defending the so-called members of the squad and kind of marrying the squad's policies, their far left positions on issues like health care, with the Democratic Party as a whole, regardless of who the nominee is going to be. I think that's the strategy. It kind of paid off in the beginning because, as you recall, they voted to condemn the president's tweets, and the squad, members of the squad, were being defended by House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, who said some critical things about members of the squad in the past. So that effort seems to be paying off, at least temporarily. Will that help in the long term? We'll see. I mean, you know the saying, no publicity is bad publicity. And man, the president, the media, they're focusing a lot on the freshman Democrat lawmakers in the so-called squad, which you never know. It could backfire by, you know, kind of making their positions more mainstream.
Yeah, and if you're going off what the media says, too, the bad publicity is very much so there for President Trump. So he may be in good shape as far as that goes. But if you're also talking about this squad, too, it is somewhat ironic a little bit because you look at people like Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar, members of that squad, who actually are from the Midwest. So it's kind of an interesting debate that's being set up a little bit. And when you heard at the very beginning, Bernie Sanders saying that he, head-to-head in polls, he likes this matchup. He says that he's winning in the polls in places like Michigan, Wisconsin, places where he won the primary. So who do you think is a more formidable opponent against the president going into 2020? A more progressive, exciting challenger, or someone like Joe Biden, the moderate, the blue-collar worker type candidate who really appeals to these type of people?
When you talk about a general election matchup, I personally still think Joe Biden is the Democrat who would give Trump a run for his money, because the election is going to come down to the same battleground states it's come down to in 2016, and it's come down to in past elections. And so I still think Joe Biden would be the best candidate for the Democrats to take on Trump in states like Ohio, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin. However, is Joe Biden a candidate who can win in today's modern Democratic Party. I mean, you saw it on the stage in these last two debates. I mean, he's moderate up there compared to a lot of the candidates like Warren, Sanders, and Harris. So the Democratic Party may not elect Joe Biden as the nominee. They may not pick him. So I think Elizabeth Warren and Harris, keep your eye on them. They're creeping up in the polls, and they could be the nominee, and we'll have to see.
And I think it's really important to point out, too, actually, is that coming out of 2016, or in the 2016 election, of course, President Trump won those states that are going to be crucial in 2020. But a lot of people would say that 2016, in a sense, was a referendum on President Obama's policies. I mean, they came out and they voted for President Trump, someone who was essentially the complete opposite. Do you think that that's a challenge that Joe Biden might face in those same states?
Absolutely. Absolutely. President Trump, if Biden is the Democratic nominee, President Trump can run essentially the same campaign he ran in 2016. Because even though Hillary was the nominee, he was running against Obama's policies, saying Hillary's going to continue them. And he can just say the same things about health care, the Iran deal, all kinds of issues. You name them. You know the issues. He could say all the same things, make all the same arguments against Biden. So I think Democratic voters are taking that into consideration. They may want a completely, clean slate and have a fresh, new face. So Biden may not be the nominee. I mean, he did better in the last debate than the first one, but he still has a lot of work to do as a candidate to capture the Democratic nomination.
Yeah, and if you're a Democrat too, you're a little scared about the idea that President Trump won on the promise of a strong economy in 2016. And as of right now, in 2020, he's looking like he's having one of the best economies in history behind him to support him. So again, at this point, only time really will really tell. But Nicholas, thank you very much for joining us tonight. And coming up next, moderates issue a warning to progressives in the Democrat debate.